It is with great pleasure to welcome the opening panel discussion on free trade agreements and gender inclusion. This session will be looking and thinking about how we organize and ready financing ecosystems and intermediaries to fuel an acceleration in COVID-19 economic recovery and facilitate also resilience for our MSMEs here in the Melanesia region. I am pleased to introduce our first panel discussant, Mr. Joe Pakoa-Lui, who's the Director for External Trade from the Vanuatu government. Mr. Pakoa-Lui, welcome. Over to you.
Thank you, Anna, moderator of this session. I'll be talking on the message defying trade agreements. I will try my best to try and explain briefly and simplify some of the trade agreements that Vanuatu is party to, especially in the region, including the WTO. But let me firstly acknowledge the MSG Secretariat and the PIFs for organizing this important symposium on trade and gender. I think this is a good topic to, and I would like to encourage our regional organization to continue to organize such a symposium like this for not only Vanuatu but the region to continue to discuss the importance of including or involving in our women, our young girls in business, so that we all contribute to the economic growth for our country and for the region. Let me read this statement by the WTO Secretary in 2007. What this report says is that the role of trade in promoting gender equality aims to advance understanding of the relationship between trade and gender equality and to identify opportunities through which trade can improve the lives of women. Before I introduce some of the agreements that Vanuatu is party to, let me provide, since it's a Storian or Talanoa time, let me say some of my observation in terms of looking at women and trade in the region and specifically to Vanuatu. There's a challenge, I think, in the Melanesian culture and also Vanuatu, where I would say it's still a barrier to for women in trade. We tend to I would say not recognizing or giving the opportunity to women to take their place. Many times in the Melanesian culture, we tend to get our women sitting at the back, whether in business, in trade, or in any value chain that we can do that in terms of trade. But then we forget that women are always the core of the trade daily. And let me point out some of the modern things that we often don't realize. If we put this in the context of trading goods, the question is, who do you find at the marketplace selling goods? It's the women who are selling the goods, exchanging goods at the marketplace. Who do you find doing the shopping, buying the goods for our homes? It's the women. Most of the women are doing the daily shopping. This is part of the trade daily that we didn't realize or recognize. On the services side, who do you washing? Like a man or man ask the question, is the woman, is the wife, or is the daughter who is doing this service at home, even cooking. most of the time. So part of this trade law, it happens daily, but we didn't recognize our women. So that's the challenge. Where this opportunity that we have in the last 2 days, I believe we will continue to encourage and appreciate our women, our trade and gender, on what they are doing, their contribution to the economy, their leadership, and the career path in business should be recognized. Until we recognize and appreciate our trade and gender, our women, then we can elevate trade and gender participation in the MSME, micro, small, and medium enterprise space. So looking at the trade agreements, in particular within the region, the trade agreements are frameworks. So I'll try my best to go specifically in the different trade agreements that Vanuatu is party to. But let me provide just a brief overview. The trade agreements are frameworks that provides opportunities for countries to increase their potential, whether what they can do best on production or processing or manufacturing, or improve their product standards, or increase their export, whether in goods or on services. Vanuatu in 2012 joins the WTO, World Trade Organization. And this World Trade Organization has different agreements. One is on investment, agriculture, a fishery subsidy that was just recently endorsed by the WTO members ministers. The trade facilitation, I think yesterday there's a session on trade facilitation, and we have on goods or the trade and tariff, specifically on the duties or custom duties. So in 2012, when we joined, Vanuatu becomes the World Trade Organization member. There's a lot of business opportunities that came up because we wanted to free our market, especially for Vanuatu. That means we reduce most of our duty rates, our custom duty rates, which we believe that they are barriers to our trade. That is so that we can import more into Vanuatu. And in 2018, if I'm correct, we joined the Pacific Island Countries Trade Agreement. This agreement covers only goods and services. Vanuatu ratifies the goods, and we still yet to ratify the protocol on trading services. And of course, MSG trade agreement, we signed the trade agreement in 1993, and in 2005, there's a new revision. But this agreement only specifically focused on trading goods, and now most of the MSG countries are duty-free across, except for sugar and spirits that are imported or trade among the MSG countries. And recently, the PISA Plus trading goods, trade agreement that covers trading goods, services, labor mobility, and the development cooperation. I think this the development cooperation component is I think makes a difference between the other previous trade agreements that I mentioned. So what are the key objectives of these trade agreements that Vanuatu is party to? And of course, few of our online country members are members to these trade agreements. The key objective of this trade agreement is for open or free market. So it means each party or each country will have to remove any barriers any barriers to trade, whether it be imported on tariffs or imported duties, import duties that are set for any imports of products coming into the country. When we join or when we sign up a negotiate a trade agreement, we wanted to reduce these duties so that there is a free flow of goods and services trade across border. And this is part of our market access over that we have to commit ourselves for Vanuatu and also other parties to the agreement. Why market access? Because we wanted to increase our trade and exports of our goods and services into across border to other members. Trade agreements provide preferential treatment. That is, you favor the parties, you're giving them duty free other than any other, and this excludes countries who are not party to the agreement. So you are giving a treatment to those countries who are members, only those who are members and not non-members. For example, the MSG countries, now we are trading across their border duty free. If we receive any, if we trade with any Polynesian countries, then that means we have to, there's a duty that we have to pay apart from PICTA. Competition, these trade agreements also encourage competition at the market. Why it encourages competition? Because it also benefits, it provides lower consumer costs and also encourages standards of products. We wanted to increase or improve the standard of different products, the different goods and services that we are offering at the local market or even to the export market. Also, the trade agreements that we are signing, we also want to improve the living standard. What is the impact for that living standard? Because we wanted to sustain trade for a long time. So when we improve living standard, when, for example, if we take coconut oil, there is a value chain, even right to the rural area, and those the rural areas communities are also benefiting, and this can also improve their living standard because of a sustainable market that we continue to export to. So, yeah, basically, and very briefly, that's the objective of why trade agreements are signed or negotiated to allow for market access for our goods and services, and to provide the opportunity for an open or free flow of trade across border. And most of the provisions inside the trade agreements, maybe they are not, they cover most, maybe very broadly, and this is something that we need to really encourage. I know my time is up now. Let me just one, Anna, maybe give me one minute. What can the MSG of Vanuatu government do? I think one of the issues that maybe we can discuss better is to continue to implement the existing policy recommendations that we have. Advocacy on trade and gender. I think this is one thing that we need to encourage more. Our priority sectors and products that we wanted to see improve or trade for a long time. Training for women in business so that they can involve in the trade, in the taking part of the trade agreements. And I think one of the issues that was mentioned during the recap session is the data availability. This is something that we need to work with our regional organizations to develop or to have this some sort of report on trade and gender, so that we can encourage our trade and gender entrepreneurs to the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Director. Please join me in giving a brief round of applause for Director Pakoa. We're going to go, and for those who've just recently joined online, just to note that we are a little bit behind schedule in the program. And here in Vanuatu, our time check is 10:30 in the morning. And we are in the opening panel discussion on free trade agreements and gender inclusion. What we will do is we'll go for those joining us virtually. And I'm pleased to introduce Ms. Meraseni Rakuita, who is the Principal Strategic Lead for Pacific Women out at the Secretariat for the Pacific Community, who's going to speak about the role of trade agreements and its impact on gender inclusiveness. I think this is a nice follow-on from what Director Pakoa Lui has set the scene around the range of agreements out there, some opportunities for us to pick up. Ms. Rakuita will speak more to their role and their impact on the Pacific's efforts around gender inclusivity. And then we'll go to Mr. Alipate Tavo in Samoa. Over to you, Meraseni. Thank you for joining this morning.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. And thank you to the panelists that will be talking about this very important topic in relation to gender and the nexus with free trade agreements. A necessary first step to the meaningful participation of women in the world of trade through gender inclusive free trade agreements is the economic empowerment of women at national level. Let me put that another way. We can have the most gender inclusive trade agreements in the Pacific, but no woman will be able to access that if national efforts are not happening for the economic empowerment of women in their own countries. The term women's economic empowerment sounds very simple, but it doesn't really encapsulate the multidimensional and intersectional discrimination and challenges faced by women in our societies across the Pacific, which continue to make gender inclusive trade agreements far removed from the lived experiences of Pacific women on the ground. The MSG Secretariat has as its vision the following: excelling together towards a progressive and prosperous Melanesia. One of the Secretariat's values reads as follows: we are an organization that exists for the sole purpose of serving the interest of our members, bearing in mind our aspirations to improve the livelihoods of all our citizens, especially our women and youths. As a sub-region, Melanesia has a population of around 10.8 million people. Around 50% of that are women and girls. So when we aspire to excel together in serving the interest of our members, bearing in mind our common quest to improve the livelihoods of all our citizens, and especially our women and youth, we must ensure that the differential impact of national policies on men and women are addressed. In the context of trade, we must ensure that our trade policies and trade agreements address their gendered impacts. Does the Melanesia Free Trade Agreement address this? Is there scope for a gender analysis to be carried out in relation to the agreement to ensure that it works towards the economic empowerment of both men and women equally? How diligent have we been in collecting relevant data in this context to inform and direct any new iteration of our trade agreement? So what does gender inequality have to do with trade? For the purposes of my contribution, I will use Fiji as an example, as I'm more familiar with key Fijian statistics and policies related to this topic. 19% of registered businesses belong to women. These businesses tend to have fewer employees and lower revenues than those listed in the name of men. They are also less likely to engage in exporting. 25% of women in the tourism sector earn less than men. Only 10% of the over 4,000 trading firms in Fiji are women-owned. And only 10% of those women who do have trading firms are actually members of a trade or industry association. And those who are not members are more likely to miss out on critical information pertaining to their industries. 17% of women traders spend more than 5 hours a day on unpaid care work, compared to only 2% of men. Who would have thought that the role of women in the unpaid care economy could actually impact on their access to trade? The formal labor force participation rate sits at 37% for women and 72% for men. 2 out of 3 women have been subjected to some form of violence during their lifetime. Again, do we think about violence against women as a challenge for accessing the trade avenues provided by free trade agreements? And the list goes on. While the percentages may differ from country to country in our sub-region, the underlying theme is the same. Evidence of social norms, unequal power relations, and discriminatory systems in place, which place women on the back burner when it comes to business and trade. To address these inequalities in Fiji, we look to the Fijian Trade Policy Framework, which includes a specific objective of mainstreaming gender to ensure coordination and policy coherence, and commits to supporting the participation of more women in business and international trade. The MSME Fiji Policy Framework includes a focus on responsive policies to address challenges faced by women-led MSMEs and those operating informally. As a region, we look to the Pacific Platform for Action on Gender Equality and Women's Human Rights, 2018 to 2030, and to the Pacific Leaders Gender Equality Declaration, 2012, as guiding instruments for regional priorities in the area of gender equality and the empowerment of women. While these instruments both recognize the economic empowerment of women as a regional priority, we still have a very long way to go to actually fulfill the aspirations that our leaders have set. When I first started working in government as a legal advisor back in the 90s, trade was one of the areas designated for me. In that context, I worked very closely with Sovaya and the former DG of MSV, Amenaya Woli. And I know for a fact, and Sovaya can correct me here if I'm wrong, that in all the discussions on trade I went to, gender was not on the table. It wasn't an issue. Barriers to trade was limited to things like tariffs, non-tariff measures, quotas, etc. Negotiating free trade agreements meant working towards the removal of such barriers to trade without any consideration for the barriers to trade that women face. It is therefore very encouraging to see such initiatives like this symposium, which aims to unpack the nexus between trade agreements and gender inclusion, and how trade agreements can work to empower women where there is an active effort to do so. Gender-based barriers to trade may include limited access to networks and decision-making, capital and trade promotion initiatives such as trade missions, gender-biased investment practices, and gender and other forms of discrimination, including sexual harassment, violence in the place of work. Specific research into the impacts of COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted that while women's role in farming for both own use or subsistence as well as for sale has increased over time, women have less access to resources such as land, information, credit, and training. This in turn reinforces patterns of female disempowerment. Women are often invisible workers on farms, producing kava, vanilla, cocoa, coffee, and other cash crops for export, working alongside their husbands or other family members, not captured in data and statistics, much less agricultural policies, priorities, and incentive programs. Mostly, any technical training aimed at producing export quality commodities is mostly offered to men, by men, agricultural extension officers, to men during the day, or at times inconvenient for women with their other household chores. It is to these barriers that we must also look to and address if we want to meaningfully include women in trade. Targeted interventions, like for example, the Fiji Development Bank's loan facility for women entrepreneurs in MSME and agriculture sector, with 10% equity provided by government can go a long way in addressing the access to finance barriers that women face in the world of business. In 2016, the MSG Secretariat commissioned a study on a selected number of products from Melanesian countries, which had the potential to be exported, or if already exported, had the potential to increase in quantity on the export market. What caught my attention were products which I know to be largely produced by women in our communities, like the bilum of PNG, or even virgin coconut oil in both Fiji and the Solomon Islands. The questions that followed were, how can the Melanesia Free Trade Agreement and national trade policies incentivize the production and export of these products within the MSG and beyond? How can we incentivize the creation of cooperatives or social enterprises which would enable many small-scale producers to meet market demands as a collective? In almost all Pacific Island countries, women who do work for pay or profit are mostly working in informal jobs and non-tradable sectors, far removed from potential export markets in value chains. To put it simply, creating environments where women can thrive as entrepreneurs and in export jobs is essential to supporting women's roles as producers in the economy. Otherwise, there can be gender-centric free trade agreements, but in paper only. Global trends, especially the rise in services, global value chains, and the digital economy, are opening up important economic opportunities for women. But how are these factored into trade agreements? Trade has the potential to expand women's role in the economy, decrease inequality, and expand women's access to skills and education. How can trade agreements reduce discrimination against women while building the significant human capital that women represent? Research on gender equality and trade is hugely constrained by limited data and a lack of understanding of the connections between the economic roles women play as workers, consumers, and decision makers. But there are some insights. Recent World Bank and ILO research highlights that exporters employ more women. In developing countries, women make up 33% of the workforce of exporting firms, compared with just 24% of non-exporting firms. The research also found women employed in sectors with high levels of export. They're more likely to be formally employed in a job with better benefits, training, and security. So what does this tell us? Countries are becoming more integrated with global value chains, which tend to create jobs and increase wages for women. Global value chains tend to have positive indirect benefits on other aspects of women's livelihoods, such as education, not only theirs, their whole families, education and health. So how do we create the enabling environment for digital technology and new online platforms to create opportunities for women to bypass traditional trade barriers, expand their entrepreneurial skills, and develop flexible careers that enable them to manage both work and household responsibilities? If these opportunities are articulated in targeted policies, women would benefit more from trade. From the experience of women entrepreneurs in Fiji during COVID-19, it is extremely difficult to create online e-commerce platforms because of national banking regulations for those SMEs who had the capacity to operate in an online environment. So how are our national regulations stifling the ability of women to trade on an online market? Gender equality considerations in trade agreements encompass economic, social, and political rights, such as the eradication of gender-based violence and discrimination, access to education and healthcare, and women's economic empowerment. As long ago as 2000, the African, Caribbean, and Pacific Agreement with the EU included numerous references to gender equality and recommended that a systemic account be taken of gender issues. How have we adhered to these principles in the Cotonou Agreement? Free trade agreements and trade policies more generally can help overcome gender inequalities by opening new opportunities for employment and prosperity. This would include removing trade barriers that impede women's access to international markets and improving women's access to education, financial services, digital technologies, financial literacy, and the list goes on. These barriers include import quotas and burdensome licensing requirements.
Sorry.
Colleagues, I think we all agree It's I think we all agree on the importance of incorporating a gender perspective in economic and trade issues. But how do we translate these paper high-level commitments into the lived realities of women and girls? That is our challenge. Thank you.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking Merasani for that. And apologies to cut you in there, Merasani, but what a powerful ending. I think she's laid the challenge we understand that trade agreements play a fundamental development role in our countries, but how can we leverage them and use them to do more in the way that Merasani has very eloquently outlined the range of opportunities and policy areas to consider. Our final speaker for this panel is Mr. Alipati Tavo, who's the Trade and Investment Advisor for the PESA Plus Implementation Unit based in Samoa. Mr. Tavo will be speaking to his work, an area of work around the PESA Plus implementation. And just for those, again, joining online and here in the room, noting that we are a bit behind schedule in the program, the next panel on trade, gender, digitization, and economic recovery, we will be aiming to commence at 11 a.m. Vanuatu time. And so we'll provide the floor to Mr. Tavo to speak to the PESA Plus implementation before allowing for a very brief Q&A and then into the next session on gender and digitization. Over to, could we just do a check that Mr. Alipati is online? And while our IT team are doing this check, I think this is a scene setting session. We've had a very comprehensive overview from the Director of External Trade Vanuatu, Mr. Joe Pakoalui, around the range of trade agreements that exist and talking about how they've been considering addressing barriers to trade. But also he ended with a call to say, we have existing policy recommendations in our Melanesian sub-region. We just need to prioritize the implementation of them. What does that mean and what does that look like? Ms. Merasani Rakuita said that she laid the challenge around, well, given the fundamental role and fundamental difference that trade agreements can make to the lives of women in the Melanesian sub-region, and she reminded us how big the population is in this part of the Pacific. 10.8 million people in the Melanesian sub-region, of which half are women. How can these trade agreements fundamentally shift the opportunities and experiences for women and do more around creating environments for an entrepreneurship to thrive, and how can we target interventions that reduce barriers of access to finance and those spaces. If Mr. Tavo is not online with us, actually this gives us a wonderful opportunity to go to Q&A. I will ask, look to the room first for any questions to our esteemed panelists around their interventions, and then we'll take some questions online. For those online, please use the raise hand function in your Zoom, which comes under reactions. I say that because sometimes I forget myself where that sits. And we'll look to the room for any comments or initial reactions. And when you speak, please state your name and the agency or business that you are representing. The floor is yours. If the camera can also follow. Thank you.
Is the microphone, is it working? Yeah, okay, great. First, thank you. I'm Julian Lisner. I work with the UNCTAD. I'm here in Vanuatu with the MSG Secretariat, and I work on the MSG Green Trade Project. First of all, I would like to thank you both for this very interesting presentation. And I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that trade allows. Okay, sorry. I have to speak louder. Is it okay? Yeah, first we need to acknowledge that trade is actually increasing, no? The cake and how we share it. And if with women empowerment, it's very important to understand that it benefits the whole community. So it benefits women, and this is very important, but it also benefits the rest of the community, the young people, the children who often get better education, get a better role model, but also the husbands, the brothers, the uncles, they all benefit from that. And so I was curious about the specific case of Vanuatu, Director for Trade. You mentioned the different agreements that are now existing in the region. And I would like to know, do you have like indications about the trade flow, for instance, since the adhesion to the WTO? How did it evolve in the region, Vanuatu specifically? I mean, in the world, but also with the other MSG countries.
Thank you. And if before we will just take a few questions for our panelists, so our panelists can debate. So we'll just check online if our IT team can see if there's a raised hand online. If there is a question for any of our panelists, we've had a first question there around trade flows since WTO accession in Vanuatu specifically, but also if there is reflections from the region. Okay, there are no, just to check in the room if there are any additional questions in the room regarding, okay, we have another question there. We'll take two questions and go back to the panel. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Max. I'm the 2022 New Colombo Plant Fellow for Vanuatu. The New Colombo Plant is a Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade program run by the Australian government. I was reflecting on the contributions made by both panelists in relation to the need to reform both hard law and soft law mechanisms in relation to both trade agreements and also domestic policy. I was thinking about the way in which the Australian government has recently tried to do some of these things to change the way that we approach policy. So for instance, I was thinking in relation to the Australian government's new climate policy, the government is going to be transitioning our fleet of cars to only electric vehicles. I was wondering if there was a place for that in relation to the current rate. So for instance, we heard that only 19% of Fiji businesses are owned with climate. Is there potentially a program in that market that can prioritize goods and services being provided by the economic status of the parts?
Thank you for the two questions. So perhaps we can go to Director Joe Pakoa-Lui to answer particularly the first question around trade flows since WTO accession, and he may wish to also comment on the second question, and then to confirm that our second panelist, Meraseni Rakuila, she couldn't hear the second question. If Max could just repeat it again into your microphone, just so that we can ensure it can be heard. And apologies for those getting dizzy with the moving screen. We're just checking that you're awake on a Friday.
I was just asking about the potential role of specific government policy in prioritizing the selection of goods and services being provided by businesses that are owned and run by women to give them, I guess, a leg up because of the, I guess, historic challenges that women in business have faced.
Thank you. So I hope that was heard for the online audience. So it's about the role of government in its policy and legislative environment in prioritizing reforms. Excuse me, sorry, that was, hello. In prioritizing areas for goods and services in MSMEs that relate to where women are primarily engaged. So we'll go to Director Joe Pakoa-Lui first, and then to Meraseni. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for those questions. I think those are good questions. Good questions. Let me respond to the WTO floor. Since Vanuatu joined in 2012, there's an increase in, I don't have the figures at the moment, but there's an increase the trade trend on especially imports. But not only imports, we continue to see Vanuatu's value-added products also there's an increase, especially with the niche markets on our few products. There is a challenge on the trade in goods, but on the services we see there's a between 2012 to just before COVID, we realized that there's an increase in trade in services that continue to counter our trade imbalance on the good side. So I think it's over 60% of our trade in services. So we see that as soon as Vanuatu joins the WTO, there's a lot of policy changes, and in particular on the trade policy front. Let me give an example on the telecommunication. Just before 2012, the government is negotiating to join the WTO, and just after we join the WTO, we have the digital. We broke that monopoly to allow for free for this telecom services to come into Vanuatu. This is part of the holistic policy, government policy to allow for competition at the market, but also our commitment to the WTO as an organization that we set the trade policy commitment, in particular on the trade agreement. With regards to Matt's question on the potential role or policy priority for selecting goods, in particular looking at trade and gender, and also the climate change and environment. For Vanuatu, I don't think we have a specific policy that covers the. There's no specific policy or regulations or law that specifically mention the importation of specific goods. And I think this is an area that we might want to look at in terms of our climate championing. In terms of environment friendly. Now that we have the our commitment also on the WTO on the trade and environment. Now we find most of the electronic are duty free at the moment, and also looking at the e-commerce. The last ministerial conference at the WTO, the ministers had agreed for another 2 years for a moratorium on e-commerce. That means we continue to import duty free on e-commerce platform using e-trade. So this is an advantage for Vanuatu while we have this e-commerce strategy launch. There's still challenge in terms of the components or the associate sectors that will encourage or support the e-commerce business online. But specifically on your question, I don't think that Vanuatu has a specific policy on this one.
Thank you, Director. We'll go to Maraseni Rakuita. Just to respond to the second question before we will say thank you to the panelists and move on. So to the next session. This question, Maraseni, would you like me to repeat it, or you're comfortable you have captured it? Okay.
I'm comfortable. Thank you. Thank you for the question. It's government plays a critical role when it comes to women's economic empowerment, when it comes to identifying products where women are already engaged in various sectors. I'll give an example from Fiji. We have what we call a Women's Expo, which is a government investment. Not much, not a lot of money, but what that expo did, starting from 2014, it brought in women from all over Fiji, most of whom were producing artifacts within their own villages with no market to sell it to. We brought them to capital. We bring them to capital once every year. Government investment, paying for the accommodation, here for 3 days in Suva and just opening up the market for them. That did two things. It didn't only create a market for the products they were producing at home, but it also encouraged them to improve the standards of those products. We have a government branding Fijian made product, which meets international standards. So what we aspired to do as a national women's machinery was to assist these women to improve the standards of their products, so much so that in our last expo in 2020, just before COVID hit, was that over 30 women qualified from 500 women, 30 qualified to meet the Fijian made standards. Now these women are supplying to those companies that export products overseas. That's the kind of intervention that governments can do for women from at a grassroots level to enable a mechanism that will allow them to access markets that they would normally not be able to.
Thank you. Thank you, Merisani. And thank you to our panelists. Please join me in thanking Mr. Jopakoa Lui and Merisani Rakuita for their presentations and insights this morning. We will now move to the panel on trade, gender, digitization, and economic recovery. This panel has been set aside at the time of, and I'm going to do a time check. I think this is important for those of us joining virtually as well. This panel has been set aside of 50 minutes of time. And so we will be looking to capture the thoughts of the panel through to midday Vanuatu time. And it is, I think this is a very good segue from the first panel that's given us a grounding and an overview of the range of trade agreements, as well as what they mean for the impact on our member countries' gender inclusiveness and development ambitions. I particularly like the theme that was picked up where the former panelist, Merisani Rakuita, said, you know, how, and Director Jopakoa Lui talked about e-commerce and the role that it could play in reducing barriers for women in business in terms of the ways in which, how they can engage in that, what policies could be considered around reducing barriers in access to national banking platforms to participate in e-commerce and to participate in online trade. So we're very privileged this morning, and I know for some of you it's in the afternoon, but here in Vanuatu, we're very privileged to have Dr. Radhika Kumar, who is the infrastructure advisor with the through the Commonwealth Secretariat, but I understand working with the Fiji government, and she will be sharing her presentation on the topic of trade, gender, and digitization. Dr. Kumar, welcome.
Hello, are you able to hear me clearly before I start?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, thank you. So I will try, and I have got a long presentation, but in the interest of time, I will be very quick. I'm just sharing my slide. I won't go through everything, just a few concepts, and yeah, just to echo and thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to be part of this very important symposium. So I've been hearing a lot about the gender perspectives from different angles, and what I wanted to actually highlight is more like on the role of digital infrastructure to address the digital divide, which will contribute to women's economic empowerment. I know it might sound a very new area, but it is something which the COVID-19 pandemic has kind of shown us, right? That we need to go online, and we need to also leverage digital infrastructure, but at the same time, how do we kind of address the gender digital divide as well? I'm trying to scroll through my presentation. Hopefully it does. Hold on. Okay. So before I go further, I just wanted to briefly provide an overview of the work that we are doing in the Commonwealth under the Commonwealth Connectivity Agenda. The Commonwealth heads of government, they had endorsed what is known as the Commonwealth Connectivity Agenda in 2018. And since then, what we have been doing is that we have 5 clusters and looking at different themes and different aspects. In the physical connectivity cluster, we are looking at a focused area about how do we leverage digital infrastructure, and then we address the digital divide. And then the cross-cutting theme is more on women's economic empowerment and also youth empowerment as well. So in 2019, what we started off with was that we invited countries, and we had a lead country, which is the Gambia, with 40 other member countries that were part of the cluster. We started with knowledge sharing experience, consensus building around this area, and we developed what we called the principles on sustainable investment in digital infrastructure. And when we developed these, we had from the Pacific, we had participation from PNG, PG, and Vanuatu, plus other Commonwealth member countries in designing this. Later on, what we did was that we also tried to run some workshops and then also identify key priority areas. And in 2020, when COVID actually hit, what we did is that we also tried to undertake a survey on the economic response to COVID-19. And from the survey, we found out that, of course, there were certain areas which countries wanted to prioritize. One was on development of MSMEs. Second was more on trying to ensure that the digital infrastructure ecosystems are in place in countries. And also, how do we then empower women and youths to get online through these? Further to that, we had done several studies. One of the very important studies. It was an assessment of the digital infrastructure divide in the Commonwealth. We have a paper on this. I can share it later. But we tried to identify what were these divides or differences in terms of the digital infrastructure. And when we looked at digital infrastructure, we were looking at it in 2 angles. First was the hardcore infrastructure, but also the soft infrastructure skills, which is the digital skills, which are actually also a very important enabler in the digital economy for post-COVID-19 recovery. I will get more into this in the later presentations. And in 2022, what we did, we tried to scale up the implementation work. And I really like the comment which Ms. Meraseni made in terms of saying that we can have as many policies in terms in economic on women and in gender mainstreaming, but the main thing is that how we then kind of operationalize the women's economic empowerment. And in the Commonwealth, for us, what we did is that we collaborated with UNESCAP this year, and we ran 2 workshops where we invited women entrepreneurs and we trained them, and they were from grassroots level, from unorganized sectors who had products. We trained them in 3 days and we put them online to do business. And if you are interested, you can even Google now on wesellonline.org, and we have women from all across the Commonwealth that are trading online. We focused on Africa and Asia at the moment, but we aim to expand this training to other regions. So if participants or collaborators are interested, we can discuss this further. So looking at the global landscape, we know that what COVID-19 brought us is, of course, deeper digitalization. But at the same time, we also note that there's greater digital divide. And we also note a very important thing if we are looking into trade agreements, gender, and digitalization, is that countries that are already more endowed with technological resources, they have got this first mover advantage, and they are the countries that would be able to export e-commerce services as opposed to those countries that do not have that tech resource endowment. So how do we address this is basically we need to, whilst we address all the traditional barriers to trade, if we are talking about e-commerce issues, we need to also develop the digital infrastructure capacity, and it will not happen overnight. We need to kind of do it stepwise and also plan and prioritize what perhaps the Pacific region as a whole needs to do. On this slide, I'll just scroll through this. It's basically trying to show the role of infrastructure and why it's important, of course, for economic investments and trade flows. Also, we note that as the demand, as the population, urbanization, health and safety concerns, and also the international trade and digitalization will rise, the demand for infrastructure is also going to rise as well. And as I've mentioned, this has also been one of the key findings of our economic response survey for COVID-19. On this slide, it's just basically trying to be, it's more just trying to emphasize why infrastructure is important for businesses, for workforce, and also good investment in infrastructure is required for supply chains and also trade facilitation. So before moving into the gender digital divide and infrastructure issue, I just wanted to show you a synergy between the different infrastructure layers. So as I think Joe mentioned that Vanuatu had done a sort of a liberalization of the telecommunication sector, which is kind of a key infrastructure for digitalization, and also linking to e-commerce. But within before even going and trading online on e-commerce, though there are different platforms available, but if a country really wants a sustainable digital ecosystem, it really wants to kind of have that comparative advantage, it needs to build the entire digital infrastructure ecosystem from the first mile to the last mile connections. So on this slide, I will just provide one example. For example, if economies are trying to say transition and they have certain basic infrastructure in place, such as energy and road infrastructure, that is key because it will then link to the first mile needs for the digital infrastructure. Now, for instance, if I'm using blockchain technology in my finance sector, then I will need to understand what are the underlying infrastructure that is required to develop that blockchain. And of course, underneath that, there's other issues such as where you will use store data, issues relating to data localization, investment in data center, data security, and so forth. This is actually another topic for discussion. We have done an online training on this, which is freely available. I'll show this later, but just to give you some of the insights on the complexity of developing the digital economy sustainably, if we are talking about digital infrastructure, and why we need to perhaps have more dialogue at the very beginning and kind of discussion in these areas, and then identify what would be the training and capacity building needs across the sector, in particular in relation to building the digital skills and capacity. Now, just focusing on the digital infrastructure divide in relation to gender, just some insights in terms of the Global Gender Gap Report of 2021 from the World Economic Forum. We note that the COVID-19 crisis, of course, led to deeper digitalization, but also it has deepened the gender gap. And in relation to economic participation, the report says that it will take 267 years to now close the gap. So if I'm, sorry, I think my screen is stuck, but I will continue with my presentation. So if we are considering this, then of course and then how we develop our policies to close this gender gap, one of the key things is, of course, for us to develop our digital economy and also empower women in the e-commerce sector. My next slide had basically in which I think my slide is stuck, but what I was trying to basically show is some of the data in terms of the gender gaps across the gender digital divide in terms of uh, different variables across the Commonwealth region, and also particular emphasis which I was trying to basically focus in. Okay, I think I've got it. But basically focus for the Pacific region. So in relation to this, we looked at gender parity in schooling, in income, in account ownership, and then also social media use. So this is basically showing the Asia context, Europe, Africa, and Caribbean, but I will focus on the Pacific context. And for the interest of members, this slide can be shared. It is already with the Secretariat. So if we are talking about economic empowerment, closing the gender digital divide, we need to consider different factors. One is basically starting from the school level. We need to look at what is the gender parity in schooling, meaning the difference in terms of access to education for male and females. And this data has been extracted from the GSMA. So in terms of the scores, for most of the Pacific countries, the scores are above 80 in terms of schooling, but for PNG, I think there's scope to improve. Also, in terms of account ownership, in access to finance, in relation to access to finance, there are certain countries that are doing good, but then other countries perhaps need to improve their scores, such as PNG and Vanuatu. Also in relation to income, and then the difference in the level of income between male and female, there's a wide variation which needs to be improved, because of course if income improves, women can start the business, they can go online, and then we can close this divide as well. And also gender gap in social media usage as well. There's two things that we have to be mindful. There's access to social media, and then also the economic utilization of the social media is also important. How do we teach women or anyone interested in doing business to capitalize on, say, Facebook or WhatsApp or other mediums? And then also mobile device ownership. It is quite good in the Pacific region, and which is promising. But however, in terms of the difference between males and females, in terms of access to mobile device, there's still room for improvement in certain countries. And why this is important is because now the main digital infrastructure tool, as you may note, to do business for most of us is basically a mobile device. So what have we done? We've also done over the past few years some other initiatives. We've been working with tech companies on building the artificial intelligence solutions. We also have developed trainings for women on e-commerce and digital marketing. And as I mentioned, we've trained almost 300 women in Asia and Africa from grassroots levels. They were from unorganized sectors. They had products, they didn't know how to go online. And in the pandemic, they were really affected. So we got those women, we trained them, and now they are actually trading online in their life. So this is something which is very practical in terms of women's economic empowerment. And if the Pacific region is interested, then we can bring such trainings to the region as well in collaboration with ESCAP. And we also have another training where we also want to empower the policymakers in the area of digital infrastructure and digital divide, so that they are able to make better policy decisions and also integrate women businesses or women in these policy areas as well. So my final reflections is, of course, we note that though the pandemic has brought some positives in terms of making us realize about digitalization, but also we have to note how we are going to address the digital divide. Countries that are at the front end of technology have got this comparative advantage. So how can the region and leverage their resources and improve in this area? And also we need to develop the digital infrastructure ecosystem. And we know that for the Commonwealth economies, we have different policies, it will differ. Even for the Pacific region, it's the same. So how do we prioritize? And even if we are trying to implement something, we need to kind of prioritize. And the principles on sustainable investment in digital infrastructure is basically key. And we are in the process of implementing some of it. So if collaborators are interested, we would like to collaborate with you on this as well in terms of implementation. And of course, development of soft infrastructure, which includes women empowerment through gender mainstreaming in the digital infrastructure policies. We do a lot of gender mainstreaming in trade policies. We do a lot of gender mainstreaming in different cross-cutting policies, but then we need to reflect on how do we do it when we are developing infrastructure policies, and in particular digital infrastructure policies. And I know that in the Pacific region, a lot of countries are members of the WTO, and some are actually maybe reflecting on doing regional digital trade agreement. But before doing that, it would be important that they assess the aspect of digital infrastructure divide as part of their development chapter in engaging in any e-commerce or digital trade agreement, and having the element of women empowerment integrated in that. With this, I'm just going to share this very quickly. This is the course which I will mention about for policymakers. We have developed this in 2021. This is free and available to all that might be interested to understand more about what is entailing the digital infrastructure and digital divide in terms of policy. And at the end, you will also be awarded a auto-generated certificate. So with this, I end my presentation. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. Thank you.
Dr. Kumar, thank you very much. I think you've given us a lot of food for thought. Please join me in thanking Dr. Kumar. I know we have people online and people in the room, and please know that there's a lot of appreciation for that presentation, particularly your points there around the compound challenge of closing a digital divide, as well as closing the gender gap, and the role that trade attention can play in that. Our next speaker will be joining us from the beautiful island of Santo in Vanuatu. Millie Ogden is a female entrepreneur. She's also a Vanuatu Chamber of Commerce and Industry Council member for the ITC sector, and will be sharing her insights into the theme of trade, digitization, gender, and economic recovery. Thank you for your patience as well with waiting online and noting that we are slightly behind schedule. Welcome, Ms. Ogden.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be speaking to you today about the ICT challenges on the ground in Vanuatu. Being in the Pacific Island states, there are high risk and high cost to our population in developing the digital infrastructure. But we have to walk, run, or ram through these challenges because we have to get to the reward part of it, and to understand our strength and to be a steward to our resources in the Pacific. My existence as a woman internet service provider is a testament that our Pacific small island market ecology, with the common law as the backdrop for commerce and the public policy space, it's working. Where there is the possibility of my participation in a predominantly male industry. So what inspired me to take on telecom was that I was in a Category 5 cyclone TC Herald in Santo, and being there, I experienced the inefficiency in being able to have rapid response. And the population that are most affected by it, I would say, are the women and girls, because they're not able to recover from this natural disaster. And so, and also in terms of public health, the hospitals also are not able to facilitate and help the people that were injured. So the regulator TRBR gave me a license after TC Herald, And I was able to also negotiate with Pacific, the satellite broadband provider, to provide connectivity to the rural islands, especially in the remote villages. And so it was rewarding to do so because the women that are landlocked or that don't have ports or roads that they can count on to be able to purchase nails, roof, or things to repair their roof or their kitchen, they're able to barter. They're able to, with partners Vanuatu, they're learning how to weave. Women in different islands shared with each other different weaving skills. And in my particular initiative here with Santos Sunset Environment Network, we collaborated to have the women compete. We had 60 villages compete to weave, and the two top villages won a VSAT, a small satellite system that provides powerful broadband to their community, but most importantly to their daughter, so they could participate in the information highway. So the women were able to also participate in e-commerce once they had the connectivity in their rural remote island village in West Santo. And they had exposure, provided also a retail space for them to showcase their talent. And they had demand from, of course, domestically, but also internationally. New Caledonia wanted to put in an order and asked for a container to be delivered or exported. So that's really great news. However, of course, there are many challenges along the way, financing being a big one for it to actually complete itself. But nevertheless, as an internet service provider, I have the flexibility to prioritize connectivity in the rural area, and it is very costly. But as a third generation Nivan from Santo, I felt a necessity to do so. If not, it will be really hard for development to take place, especially for us in the different provinces that might not have as much visibility as if we were in the capital, in Ifate. So I also would like to highlight that the Chamber and Vanuatu Business Resilience Council also delivered liquidity to the humanitarian response in TC Harrow in Santo through the Unblock Cash program, where they used a blockchain and also in collaboration with Oxfam to implement a humanitarian response cash transfer system. And a big part of it was really teaching the adaptation on how the merchants would be able to accept a card system, and then people in the rural would be able to receive a stipend to be able to purchase materials that they would need to repair and survive after TC Harrow. Of course, as Dr. Kumar just highlighted, women face unprecedented challenges due to the digital divide. But I would like to say, in terms of prioritizing our infrastructure development in the private sector, people like myself can be creative once we are empowered to do so. But also, we do have to have an urgent push because as women in the Pacific, we're not just competing with other humankind. We are also competing with an accelerated development of artificial intelligence that in some concern area, that it could also increase our economic and gender gap differences. And so we need to be aggressive about including our voice, our female voice, our woman voice from the Pacific to be included in this AI algorithm development. When I was also in Kigali, for the ITU development sector gathering during Baudin Martin, the director of the ITU, mentioned that a 10% increase in broadband has the potential to increase 2% in better GDP performance. So we do need to prioritize and convince a policymaker to prioritize these ICT development. And our digital development strategy, of course, requires financing. So our top level commitment to infrastructure is as important as transport, the development of transportation, water, and electrification. And we need to focus our bandwidth priorities, and I would recommend the education sector. And of course, we need to be open to the advancement of technology. We are trying to break through the monopoly, but I would say being on the ground, it is very difficult still to be a new service provider and with new technology, because due to our high cost of doing business in Vanuatu due to the natural environment, natural disaster risk, and many other risks that exist, such as our inability to scale. I would say, as a small development state, we have the support from the international community, and at Kigali, the ITU WDTC did pass a resolution 55 and that has a gender lens. So that is very encouraging, that the problem is enormous, that we cannot overcome this ourselves. We absolutely need everyone to join hands and to have policy focused areas that have this gender lens. So of course, there's access challenges for women in the rural, adoption, and also value creation. So there is a digital transformation wheel that we can, that can guide us through this development transformation. And many of you will be speaking about that. In closing, I would say, please, for those of you who are here, be an advocate, be a sponsor of our youth in our community, but especially the girls, because they need time to ramp up and gather their technical skills. It takes time to gather these experiences. Our developing nation challenges may be difficult for them to be achieved, our challenges may be difficult to overcome because of our electricity and high data cost. And also let's say the girls taking classes from now West Santo that was never available before, but due to my services, they are now able to take online classes at USP to be able to participate in e-commerce in the future, but at a minimum to keep up with their education and be able to be competitive in the global economy. But even with that available to them, if they're lucky to be close to a solar panel, which they can charge their mobile device to go to Moodle, but they also have a constant fight to survive natural disaster risk, such as heavy rain or cyclones and other risks that they face. I would also recommend that you start early, give our youth challenging public policy matters for them to ponder, and have a possible environment for them to mimic and carry out their creative vision. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ogden. If you could all join me in acknowledging both our panelists who have tackled a very big topic and highly relevant. I think, as Ms. Ogden said, the COVID pandemic has re-emphasized our focus on the digital space. And we've heard from both panelists about the importance not only of the bridging the digital divide, but in facilitating that investment in digital infrastructure but taking the approach that also addresses the fundamental gender gaps or gender exclusions that occur. There was some good discussion there about where policy and trade policy can intersect with some of these considerations. I'm very interested actually to hear about, we've talked about the positive aspects to a point of going into e-commerce and the opportunities that exist both for our female entrepreneurs, our MSMEs. I do have a problem with that acronym. We've heard about the many opportunities and the policy opportunities. There are, of course, the challenges, and we've heard about those as well from a policy and legislative sense. And of course, I imagine there would be more. I'm very interested in hearing from those of us joining online, as well as those of us here in the room in Vanuatu. Firstly, your reactions to the panelists and any questions that have been prompted, or even just some reflections to share from your own experience or your in this area of trade and digitization. We have, just as a time check, we have our panelist from the Pacific Islands Forum has sent their apologies. They're unable to join, and our subsequent session as well with regards to, let me just have a quick flick of my page. Thank you. With regards to trade, gender and sustainable development, those panelists have also sent their apologies, but we'll collapse it into this conversation, which gives us until a good, healthy 25 minutes to 30 minutes for discussion. So please raise your hand online for a virtual question, and perhaps we'll start again here in the room because I can eyeball people and make them ask a question. And they're all avoiding my eye contact. Actually, thank you. Director Joe Pakoa-Lui will be asking a question.
Thank you, Moderator Anna, for giving me the opportunity. And then let me thank Dr. Ratika and Kanchala Mili for your presentation. I think two things that I picked from your presentations, which I think it's important to reflect on in this meeting. One is the synergies between the different sectors. I think even including organizations, our regional organizations, to work with each other in terms of looking at the developing the digital divide or economic development in this region. We need to work together, and like Councillor Miller, you mentioned, even though despite the high cost, but prioritizing the infrastructure development, I think it's important for the Pacific as well, and also the individual country looking at the digital development in terms of different businesses that we wanted to pursue. And given the e-commerce strategies that was launched by Vanuatu, and also I recognized the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat e-commerce strategy, I think the main thing here is looking at the infrastructure, looking at the cost, looking at the different business platform that we wanted to encourage our people, even looking at our trade and gender. I think this opportunity is there, but we need to build on what are the priorities. I think the infrastructure is important, an important policy that or priority that the government in the region and even individual countries should look at it, have it developed, and like you mentioned, yes, there's a high cost, especially for Vanuatu, in doing business. That's a real challenge. And for Vanuatu, we have our population, 70 or to 80% of our population in the rural area, and we are vulnerable to disasters. So this is another challenge that we are facing. But these are the two things that I wanted to comment on. the synergies with all sectors and our priorities looking at the infrastructure development to encourage the digital economy.
Thank you, Director Pakoa Lui, for the comment. Well, also, I could see that we have a hand online. If the UNCTAD representative could make your comment. Thank you. And if you have bandwidth, please do share your video.
Hi, good afternoon, good morning, colleagues, and thank you so much to all the panelists for the really insightful and thought-provoking presentations. And Radhika, especially, thank you. I found some of the stats that you shared to be quite stunning, frankly, so real eye-openers. I was actually reflecting on this point while listening to the legislative barriers, infrastructure barriers, digital barriers that we were speaking about today. But I was actually reflecting on the fact that behind all these things are the people involved. We are all social characters and people, and I would be interested to hear from the panelists as to any data, stats, information that or studies that you have done, maybe from the Commonwealth Secretariat, reflecting on connecting that softer, more intangible aspect to these more tangible frontline legislation, infrastructure, digital economies and things like that, because it's the people behind these things that, and it's the culture. It's frankly, I mean, it's a global culture, a patriarchal culture that is creating or setting the foundation for some of these barriers that have not been realized. And in some cases, it'll take 267 years to realize. So yeah, I would be interested to hear about thoughts behind bridging that gap between people and the legislature, between people and the digital divide. Because I hear the same conversation in whichever sector of work that I sit in on, whether it's agriculture, whether it's SMMEs, whether it's even environment, disaster, it's the same thing. The gap is across the board. And the common foundation there is our culture and worldviews about how women and gender should, I don't know, should be a part, but is never really, everything ends up being quite blind to it. Yeah, so just some thoughts there, and maybe I'd be happy to hear about panelists' perspectives on it. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Do we have any other hands up online just while we're there?
Moderator, this is the Vanuatu High Commissioner in Australia.
Welcome, High Commissioner. Please proceed.
Thank you. And first of all, I'd like to thank all the panelists for giving such amazing presentations. I've been listening with great interest on this digitization, but especially the role of women, the gender into the digitization economy as well. I have three main questions, and I don't think I heard them during the presentation. The first one would be around the literacy, the financial literacy, or I would say IT literacy as well for our, not only for our female, but also for our male population. As to how do we target that? How do we ensure that our people are also digital savvy to understand different usages of how to go online and set up business? For example, if they want to open up platform. Nowadays, we see a lot of social media users in Vanuatu, but also abroad. And there's a lot of, I would say, businesses conducted via social media. You could go on an Instagram page and see people posting their products on Instagram page as well. I understand that on one hand, we have the policymakers that should provide I would say, a rather safe environment, online environment for that through legislations and policies. But on the other hand, we also have the, I would say, the stakeholders, the private sector, the clients that should also be able to connect on that platform that is already there, that space that is already there, providing by the policymakers. So sometimes I tend to think that there's a mismatch in between what the policymakers are doing and also the practitioners, the people that should establish those businesses online, especially our female counterparts that could be doing that online as well. So how do we bridge that gap between the policymakers, in providing a safe environment, but on the other hand, the people that will use it in making sure that they could also sell their products online via Instagram or via their social media platforms. And I think financial literacy, correct me if I'm wrong, but could go a long way in that as well, in training those people in understanding the concept, but mostly digital literacy as well for our people. And I want to think outside the box as well, and thinking that maybe this is something that should be also included in our school curriculum as well, in teaching our young generation to already embed those ideas and to already do that. In when, as they move along life, they can already looking into venturing into those type of businesses. And COVID has clearly shown us that online businesses has become so important during COVID, because no one can go to the shop and buy their food or buy whatever they want. They could just stay home in the comfort of their home and order everything online. And I think we have a lot to catch up on for Vanuatu, but I think that there are great initiatives and great potential, such as we've just heard from Millie, that she's presenting the challenges that she faced as well in her business, and I thank her for that. My second question would be in terms of security, online security for our people. We've heard that online security could also be a problem not only for our Pacific region, but could also be a problem in first world nations as well. We've heard a lot of people stealing money from the banks via fraudulent tactics and all of that operations. So how do we make sure, as Pacific Island countries, how do we proceed in terms of online security for a safe digital, I would say a safe digital aspects of our work that we want to do online? Is it something that Melanesian Spearhead Group could think of to provide some regional or sub-regional policies, and working together with partners in the region to provide those regional policies on e-commerce? I heard that the Pacific Island Forum has already produced some documents on that, or policy papers on that to be endorsed. I'm not sure where we are. Maybe moderator, you can help us in saying where they are at the moment. But my question would be mainly around these areas. And my last question would go mainly, as we deal with Pacific Islanders, we and also in different parts of the world, we deal mostly with what we call indigenous people. And in the Pacific region, we do understand that we come a long way. We are indigenous people of the Pacific. And so sometimes we do have our traditional, I would say, the traditional way of doing things as well in our communities. And so I would like to see this aspect of trade and gender also capturing a little bit of gender, in terms of our culture across the Pacific region. How do we, I would say, where is the meeting point, between our culture, how we do things in our community, but also advancing in life? Now, advancing does not necessarily mean, according to me, that we need to leave or forego our culture. We can still keep our culture and moving forward. But how do we include that? How do we embed that part of advancement in technology and everything, and at the same time keeping our different cultures as well across the Pacific? And we know that culture plays a lot, especially in terms of gender as well in the Pacific. So I'll stop here, but I think these are my three main questions that I would like to put forward to the presenters, but also to other members of the panel. The other members of the participant members here this morning on this platform. Thank you, moderator.
Thank you, High Commissioner. So what we'll do, and I know we have one more question or comment in the room, but before we go to that, we'll perhaps deal with the question from UNCTAD colleague who was addressing a question to Dr. Kumar around studies on connecting the around this, the how the gap is bridged between people and legislation. Given the presentation there. And then after we have Dr. Kumar's response to that, we'll take a comment in the room that may assist with the High Commissioner's comments and then hand to Ms. Ogden as well for some commentary around the aspects of digital literacy and online security. So we'll go first to the UNCTAD question to Dr. Kumar about studies in this area. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. I think before I focus on that, I think I was going through my presentation a little bit, too quick, and maybe I've missed this point when we are looking in the Commonwealth on leveraging digital infrastructure. What we consider infrastructure into two elements. One is, of course, the hard infrastructure, which we usually consider in terms of like roads, energy, ports, maybe telecommunication, fiber optics, and all those. Then there's the cross-cutting element of the digital infrastructure, which we call the soft digital infrastructure development, which is basically developing the core digital skills in different areas, right? And then we noted the fact that, of course, there's a lot of need in terms of developing this. And of course, it is true, because if I'm looking into the entire digital infrastructure ecosystem, I just don't need, you need to train people to get online to sell their product. But underneath, there's a lot of things that happens. And Millie might also agree. She was talking about AI. Then we need to train people in coding. We need to train them in cybersecurity. We need to train them in a plethora of things, right? So that if we are to develop the entire digital infrastructure ecosystem, the digital skills is key. That I totally agree. Now coming to the studies, we did 2 studies, which I can actually share. And I did mention in my presentation, but I was too quick again. In the interest of time, one was basically what we did is the economic response survey to COVID-19 recovery in 2020. And there also, we've got some findings in terms of how to bridge this gap between the policymakers and also the legislation and also the private sector. Then also further, we tried to do an assessment of digital infrastructure divide. And then there's what I discussed is basically just showing a synopsis of the gender digital divide, but we have got digital divide studies in that paper in terms of access, affordability, quality, soft digital infrastructure, which is the digital skills, and then the gender digital divide. So the course which we have developed is based on that. And if you go through that course in your own self-paced time, you will get a lot of information, but I will also share both the studies with the Secretariat, and then you can also share with those interested. Now coming to the practical side of things, right? We just don't write papers, we don't produce knowledge products, we have to implement things as well. And in doing so, what we've done, as I mentioned in 2022, we've brought in with UNESCAP, what we've done is we've trained women because we realized this digital skills gap that existed when COVID hit at a greater scale in terms of women's economic empowerment. And we got women from grassroots levels. In the first training we did was in Nepal for the Asia region, and we trained 100 women to get online and do basically business, and they're actually trading online after 3 days. They upload their products, they are taught about how to use all this digital media as well, WhatsApp, Instagram, and so forth. And plus there's a special platform which is free to women. Anyone can get online. It's We Sell Online, and it's only exclusive for women. Women from the Commonwealth countries, they can get trained, upload their products, and men are the buyers, but the women are the buyers and sellers. So it's exclusively for women, and that is something which we did. And then again in Maldives, we did another training.
Sorry, just so
Yeah.
we can have room for some other questions and comments.
Okay,
because
sorry.
if you wanted to wrap up that example, and then we'll get back to the
Yeah,
other question.
okay.
Thank you.
So in Maldives, what we did, we then brought in the policymakers and also the women entrepreneurs together, because we also realized that there needs to be a balance also where we get the policy and the legislation plus the real practical private sector together, and then we train them in this and there we train like hundreds of women. And also, as I've mentioned in my presentation, if the MSG or other collaborators in the region are interested to work with us to bring such trainings to the women and policymakers in the region, then we can have a discussion on that as well in the future. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Kumar. And to pick up the other questions that were asked of the panelists and the comments that were made around particularly that point of digital literacy, and Dr. Kumar from the Commonwealth Secretariat has touched on that aspect to a degree. And I you know, drawing together the threads of Ms. Ogden's presentation from her experience running an ICT business in Vanuatu, and the access to infrastructure and the requirements for investment in digital infrastructure. That's one part of the challenge. Then there is the digital literacy and the financial literacy, which the High Commissioner of Vanuatu has mentioned. But there's the digital literacy and what needs to be done there that's been very clearly described by the Commonwealth Secretariat experiences. And then there's a question that the High Commissioner of Vanuatu has asked around the security of these platforms and the security of engagement in these platforms. I'm going to draw in a comment from one of the those participants here in the floor who will introduce themselves. Over to you, sir. If the camera could follow over my shoulder. Try speaking into the mic and see if that. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Jesse Secretary from the Pacific Fusion Center. I'm one of the analysts from the Fusion Center from PNG. Thank you for the opportunity to I share my opinion or my comments on what has been discussed, especially on the security. I think there's 3 parts to it. There's the other first part is the infrastructure. That's to have the citizens to have access to the services, and that's the other part where the users come to access the services online or the platforms. And the other one is the security part of the using those resources. So I really like the presentation from the Dr. Kumar, bridging the digital and divide gap and reaching the last mile. I think at the end of the day, we want citizens to have access to the platforms, but if the infrastructure doesn't reach the citizens, how will they have access to those services? So I think that was a very important point that the doctor has alluded to. And the other one is the users. If they want to use a platform, they have to be educated or IT literacy. So if, especially female folks, if we can have those IT literacy skills, if they can be, you know, literate with IT, especially to know how to deal with those applications. Because when you want to trade online, you have to know what to do with the application. So literating them with those user guides on how to use it. And then it comes back to the security of it. And if you put it in security, like if you're not IT literate, how are you going to know that this is a scam or this is, you know, sort of, so like there's a lot of cyber phishing. We call it cyber attack or cyber phishing. So those are very prevalent in Pacific, and our women folk and especially also the men folk are not safe, especially because we have witnessed cyberbullying online as well. So those are the security issues that's trending at the moment. And one question that I would just pose is, do we have any mechanisms to protect those online, as the Commissioner of Vanuatu has alluded to? Do we have any mechanisms in place to protect those online users or the traders? Because that's very important, because they can be scammed into stealing their money by scamming them, or maybe telling them to do something that is not supposed to do. So that comes back to the literacy of IT, to the women folk to know what to do. And it comes back to the awareness of how to use the applications to do trading. I think that's my comment for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. And I think that's a really important point there around the protection of online traders. And this question that was asked around, is there a role for MSG on e-commerce? And that's been an important highlight of an aspect of the digitization of trade. We'll take one more comment from the floor, and then we'll go to Ms. Ogden, and then Savaya Marawa from the MSG to help assist with the question about the role of the MSG on e-commerce. So take from the floor, please remember to introduce yourself.
All right. I think it's lunchtime now. It's 12 o'clock here in Vanuatu. So my name is Jalen Malefwasi. I'm also with the Pacific Fusion Center as one of the seconded analysts to be here in Vanuatu. Well, first of all, thank you so much to Dr. Kumar and all our panelists for the presentation. It was eye-opening as well. So my question is, well, I'm more into the products that women produce in terms of trade. So my question is, how can MSG, or what mechanisms does MSG can use or put in place to protect products are traditionally made by women within the Pacific, to make sure and to ensure that Pacific women have the ownership to be producing those products? Because, in this big world trade arena, for us in the Pacific, we are very small. But how do we protect our women and the products that they produce, so that we don't see traditional products, made from a company that we can't even pronounce their name? So how do we protect these traditional products that are made by women within the Pacific, to ensure that we, the Pacific women, are the only producers of those traditional products? So that's my question. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for that. So we have that question dovetails very well with the High Commissioner's question around the intersection of trade, gender and culture. And it also is a question I think our MSG colleagues can assist with. But before we go to our MSG colleague to answer the specific questions for the MSG, I'd like to go back to Ms. Ogden. If there are some of your reflections on the questions that have been asked, particularly given your business experience and knowledge of this sector.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yes, all your challenges and all your concerns they do come up, and so I recommend that for the policy issue and connecting the last mile, that perhaps we have the analyst or a collective government body that can calculate, economically speaking, a positive externality equation or number for an ICT enabling amount of money or fund, because even when you provide connectivity to the rural, it is not sufficient, as many have mentioned about adoption and literacy. So an example, but before I do so, I would say that if you do go to the last mile, every country has its unique challenges. For example, Solomon Island and Fiji might have a scale issue to compete at the world market. Papua New Guinea might have an issue of the mountainous region to access all of its population, especially its rural community. But Vanuatu, we are really more like a water country. Water is not friendly to electronics. And so with ICT, you know, those devices and electronics, they provide quite a challenge to deliver to the rural. And I would like to really emphasize the rural development of ICT, even though Port Vila and Santo constant electricity to power up our telecom. But because you know, it is important to protect something unique about our culture, and I would say I would really emphasize the agriculture trade, which is the kava trade, for example, in Vanuatu, that is a highly valued commodity in the world market. And so I would definitely, you know, try to amass some kind of equation that the government or some agencies will say, great, now let's really enable this, because just because you provide data doesn't mean people have the devices to use it or the know-how. So I will give you an example of a project which Pacific Satellite provided free equipment to the rural. And we were giving even data to the clinics to be able to use, especially during these pandemic time. Is really important for the rural clinics to have access to telecom, not only to abate maternal death, but you know, for many other reasons. But just because there is data, the nurses actually don't have the devices. They're not incentivized to have the broadband. You know, they don't have broadband before, so they don't have the devices to use it. So then I needed to have another agency, which we were very fortunate. Australian Aid came in and provided a small amount of money to provide money to buy smartphones, which I went to Computer World and purchased a good 30 of it. And when I had the device in my hand, it was so expensive to go back to the rural that I asked the clinicians, the nurses, to come and get it from me. And even when it's free for them to get the device, they have the data in their area, they still could not come to collect the device. So the challenge is enormous. And for Vanuatu, we have to really think back to a place where there's no electricity in the rural, no running water. In that sense, for ICT development, when you need essential services, and then so we really need a lot of assistance there. And in terms of cybersecurity, I would say different technology have different kind of a limit to them. So for example, a subsea cable, you could actually have viruses run through all the way through. Satellite broadband, the Pacific technology actually only limits the security to the particular beam. So you actually have to live in Vanuatu and launch your virus or your bug or your scam to be able to proliferate. So I would say cybersecurity is a nebulous topic that a lot of us don't have the know-how, but believe it or not, artificial intelligence have been created to protect you know, broad cybersecurity type fraud. But there are also artificial intelligence that are created to compete with other artificial intelligence within cybersecurity. So it is a complicated topic. But we will slowly address it. But I would say for that particular topic, have a sense of abundance. And we need to push forward regardless of the fear and the challenges and the threat that we might have, because the threat of illiteracy for yet another generation, especially in of women being illiterate, to then not be able to teach their future generation, you know, how to read and write, I think that's a bigger problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ogden. And we'll go to our final comment here from Ms. Savaya Marawa, who is the program lead on trade at the MSG Secretariat, who will address those questions or comments from the floor around the role for the MSG in facilitating an e-commerce strategy for the sub-region, but also to consider what role does it play in protecting, how can such a strategy protect online traders, and also how else can MSG trade support assist with protection of traditional items of trade where trade, gender and culture intersect. Over to you, madam.
Thank you very much, Anna, for that. Just a question that was raised by the High Commissioner with respect to energy e-commerce policy. In 2020, we collaborated with the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat in the development of the Pacific Regional E-commerce Assessment, and which led to the drafting of the Pacific Regional E-commerce policy and roadmap. So we already have from that particular activity, there's already a assessment report for the MSG prepared as part of that work. And so the next step for us is to work with, try and work with PIFs to have a policy developed for the MSG. Now, because of how the technical assistance was drafted, we were not able to get that policy in line. But the need for to have a e-commerce policy for the MSG is relevant, given that we have the new Melanesian Free Trade Agreement. So one of the chapters on trade and services, it deals with electronic commerce. So what we need to do is have a policy that will enable the facilitate the implementation, or our members to implement the provisions of the Melanesian Free Trade Agreement as well. So I'm liaising right now with Jill Jurma, hopefully, and through this deployment host agreement that we've signed with Forum Secretary, we hope to get this particular policy addressed. The question on cross-cutting issue on trade and gender, and with respect to protection on traditional knowledge, already the MSG have a framework treaty on the protection of traditional knowledge and expression of culture. And that framework treaty was signed in 2011. So what it does is the treaty seeks to protect traditional knowledge holders, like those who've developed the basket, traditional baskets that we have, and also protect owners against any infringement of their rights under the treaty. Also under the treaty, it provides for stronger, closer cooperation and understanding amongst our members. So in relation to traditional knowledge and expressions of culture. So right now to date, none of our members have yet to ratify that. So we're still working with our members to get that ratified. But having said that, I think there's some developments too that we've noted at the national level. Interestingly enough, here in Vanuatu, Vanuatu was able to protect the baskets, the traditional baskets that we bring along. Something like this one the lady who initially designed it, she was able to get it protected under the Department of Intellectual Property Rights. And that was a milestone achieved for Vanuatu with respect to protection of their traditional knowledge. And I'm sure our other members as well have their own experiences that will help our women folks as well, and our traditional owners to protect their products. So those are, I believe, I hope I've answered questions, Anna.
Vinaka Savaya. So that brings us to the end of our panel discussion this afternoon now on trade, gender, digitization and economic recovery. I'd like you all to join me in thanking our panelists, Dr. Kumar and Ms. Ogden, for their time this morning and sharing their experience and knowledge. And what will happen now in this Trade and Gender Symposium is that we will now rejoin in a plenary discussion with the other breakout room sessions and hand back to the MSG Secretariat team to consolidate the outcomes of the past 2 days. Thank you all and have a pleasant place wherever you are.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
But I also was wondering.
One particular one that you just mentioned,
Yeah.
which I've never had.
Which one?
The one that the viruses are within the network.
For the satellite.
Yeah, that's something new.
That you can create local viruses in your own satellite network.
I just want to ask if you can help that out.
Well, you know what we could do is we'll get a contact from the chamber people.
Yeah.
And then we can start.
What did you mean by the?
Yes. But I was what everyone's saying.
Yeah. But you remember the movie?
Which movie?
This is the movie, you know, like this is like code look, you know, that she's mentioned.
Yeah.
The satellite, yeah. And so they control it, you know, to have a private space.
Like, doesn't have boundary. But
Yes.
when it said sort of, there's a boundary.
Yeah.
Always.